So it's interesting the fact that I'm discussing this after a communication that focus on temples, because temples initiate a big discussion among African philosophers themselves, and it is interesting that the focus of my conversation will have a lot to do with the decolonization of, if any, of African environmental ethics. So I try to give this title to this communication. So I first want to reflect on if the question even is relevant to be raised, to be asked. And the next point will be to show that maybe the key, one of the key contributions that African environmental ethics or African environmental ethicists can bring to the global conversation about the climate crisis and all the other environmental challenges that we are facing today will be to decolonize not only ethics, but also environmental ethics. And by ethics here, I try to look at it in the broad sense. So ethics here could be also environmental justice, etc. So it's the broad umbrella of ethical theory or normative theory in general. And one area where I think that there could be an interesting contribution of African environmental ethicists or ethics is on that notion of, or that concept of sustainable development. Maybe I would like to hear from Thierry a little bit more how we'll address and understand this concept. So why would I wanted first to discuss the merit of the question is because in general, when we talk about ethics, we think that there is a universal, it is something that is universal. And that asking if there is an African environmental ethics could imply that ethics is not necessarily universal, and that it is certainly ethnological. And the reference here to temples is also interesting, because the way Temple's philosophy was described by those who the early analysts of his book, it was called ethnophilosophy. So there was this debate that ethnophilosophy is not real philosophy. It's ethnology of philosophy. So I challenge that. I think that ethics is not universal, that we have different kind of perspective of what ethics should be. And another merit of the question is that we can ask ourselves if there's a shared understanding of the environment and how morality should consider all beings, especially the relationship between humans and non-humans, including the environment. And the way I try to frame the question entails that we have a plural or pluriversal understanding of what the environment is or means and what human, non-human relations should be. And the last one is about, let me do this. It's about the notion African. So if we say that, is there an African environmental ethics? There is something, a location, a geographical location, traditions, values that inform the way we think about or the way we reflect on ethics. And in that sense, there is a perspective of based on African tradition and values of how we think our relations with the environment, with non-humans should be. But as I mentioned, it is not purely African, meaning that there is a lot of other influences because of the human nature and the fact that the African continent is not a closed continent. So there are some influence, but there is also an area of values and traditions that many could consider African originated, if I can say. I don't know why it is not, okay. So second, what I would say is that we know that climate change is a global challenge. And one issue with that is that the most vulnerable, who also happen to be the least causally responsible for this happening, suffer the most of its most harmful effects. And this creates a significant global injustice. But we also know that climate change is a consequence of a normative approach to the human-non-human relations that have informed so far the global economic agenda. And at the center of that agenda, there is, I would say, normative inclinations like instrumentalism, individualism, what I call GDPism, and that maybe the failure of addressing it robustly come from an in the current normative box mindset that seems to sustain development instead of developing sustainability, and I will come back to that notion of, and so what I'm trying to propose here is that we exploring alternative normative foundations, including those from Africa, can contribute immensely to pluriversal environmental ethics. And this starts by decolonizing environmental philosophy in the Anthropocene and exploring out of the current normative box solutions to develop sustainability instead of sustaining development. So what is key in what I'm trying to propose here as, let's say, an African environmental ethics is this notion of decolonization. And of course, we know that the political decolonization, or let's say the legal one, the international relations, in the 60s, many African countries decolonized, and there was an end to the political decolonization. But I think there is a debate if that the end of that political decolonization also affected knowledge decolonization. And the I would say the productive debate about knowledge decolonizations today makes sense given how knowledge affects many other dimensions of our social, political, and economic life, nationally and at a global level. So one reason, so if decolonization is important in general, why will be the reason? I think some reasons are that there are a lot of unintended consequences of Western centrism. The idea that all true or validated or recognizable or praised or legitimate way of doing research or collecting and producing knowledge is Western-centric. And the unintended consequence of that is that it prevents both Western intellectuals from being aware of alternative source of scholarship, but also it prevents non-Western intellectuals of taking seriously their own, I would say, indigenous knowledge. And the other unintended consequence is that because of that, the Western-centric, or many will talk about Eurocentrism, I prefer to put it in the Western basket altogether, is that the potential ideas that could help address some of those situations do not receive the publicity they may deserve because they are marginalized by, I would say, a business of knowledge production that is Western-centric. So if we lose something by just focusing and keeping the dominant view of how we should address issues like the global climate crisis, how should we that knowledge imbalance and inequalities already? And remember that the goal of doing that is because knowledge production is instrumental in helping us to address the global crisis, like the climate crisis. So how do we decolonize? There is an interesting model that I call here the DDR, which claims that the way we decolonize is by deconstructing what it presented as universal, rationality or reasons, etc., or Western environmental philosophy. This connection will be how colonized intellectuals or intellectuals from colonized areas address their own internalization of that universal way of thinking about things. And the reconstruction will be a new space that is neither de-Westernizing nor Westernized, but that is pluriversal, which is we have different approach of what the universe should look like and our relation with nature should look like. And how do we, first of all, are allowed to present those different approach on, and how do we put together some sort of dialogue that will help bring some sort of overlapping between this different approach or pluriversal approach of the relations between us and nature. So I will go very fast here. What I want to say is that we cannot move directly to the decolonization of environmental ethics if we do not decolonize ethics itself. And decolonizing ethics itself means that we should recognize that global ethical theories are not universal. They are Western perspective of what global ethics should be or what universal ethics should be. And recognizing that means that we should address in a very critical way Western-centric foundation of global ethics. And the outcome of that deconstruction is that we are not dismissing, the goal is not to dismiss the current dominant approach of ethics, but to recognize them as perspective based on Western values and traditions. So the disconnection, I go very fast there. The goal here will be for African thinkers to think by themselves and to emancipate themselves and not take for granted the current dominant theory, ethical theory. And the reconstruction will be, the goal of the reconstruction will be to adopt pluriversality and no longer universality. And pluriversality here is that one thinking about the world or the universe from a pluralist rather than a monist perspective. And universality is one thinking about the world or the universe from a monist rather than a pluralist perspective. This means that aiming at pluriversal ethics, not global ethics, is not about finding new ways of sorting out the meaning of justice, but rather about finding new ways of relating to ourselves and to each other in our pursuit of whatever we think of as justice. So pluriversality here does not mean that African scholar will think from their side, Western scholar will think from their side, and they will, no, it means that a curious scholar, I think, will try to assume that there is a pluriversal way of looking at ethics and make an effort to know the other perspectives. So, of course, I think many scholars from the colonized world, the previously colonized world, do already that because they live in those, I would say, cultural background and study dominant ethical theories. So they are almost already constrained to try to do that. The question is, are there a lot or many Western scholars who will start adopting also the same position and try to, in their own work, adopt this pluriversal approach of ethics? So how do we make the reconstruction? And here, I think there is an interesting paper written by Graham, myself, and Pius, and two other colleagues. And I think what is interesting in the methodology here is how do we build a dialogue that keeps, let's say, the position of intercultural philosopher and decolonial philosopher who strive to achieve the same thing, which is, I think, pluriversality, but we use the different kind of means to do that because of the cultural background, the different cultural background they are coming from. And in that paper, we try to say that there is a productivity in the confrontations that these groups of scholarship can have. So what will the reconstruction will be? So I think that the reconstruction could be built around what I call the relationalism, which will be close to many African approach of ethics, like Ubuntu, but Ubuntu is not the only one. And what is interesting and key with relationalism is that it tries to define the rightness of an action insofar as that action promotes shared identity among people grounded on goodwill. That an act or let's say public policy or decision is wrong to an extent that it fails to do so and tends to encourage opposite of divisions and ill will. So which brings me to decolonizing environmental ethics. What will all of this will mean for environmental ethics? I think the first thing is the deconstruction, that we have to dismantle the Western-centric foundation of environmental ethics as universal. The disconnection part can have several steps, but that will be one step. I would say no longer, I think many people will agree that it's no longer makes sense to just adapt without any critical reception of Western-centric environmental ethics in many African countries, and that the goal of the disconnection is to develop a substantive and new approach to environmental ethics that is based on relationalism. It's what will be the contribution of African ethicists to this pluriversal dialogue on ethics. So I think that there is two alternatives. or two models on what reconstruction will mean in that decolonizing process. One is what I call a non-ideal situation. The idea here is that we will use, let's say, Oromo indigenous ethics or different kinds of individual indigenous or African environmental ethics and try to see how we maintain the current system. But I think the ideal situation will be to use the opportunity that this crisis, the global climate crisis, gave us to rethink the entire system of our economy. And it is an opportunity for African environmental ethicists to suggest, to propose a new model of economics that is based on harmony and cooperation and no longer on individualism and competition.
Thierry, I feel inclined a bit to cut you short. But could you close perhaps with
yes. So I will close with just this, what I call the pluriversal ethics of sustainability and the concept of sustainable development. So the idea here is that sustainable development has become the cornerstone of, I would say, international policies. So we know about the sustainable development goals that are being discussed everywhere. But I think that if we look at the way the concept is being framed, it is an invitation to sustain development, to try to ensure that we continue in the path of growth, because growth means also income, wealth that will help address many other important needs of people. But I think that what the alternative model 2 will suggest that we do is that we should interpret sustainable development as developing sustainability, and therefore redesign all of our institutions that they develop sustainability instead of sustaining development, which means that there is a lot of businesses, a lot of models, a lot of economic policies that will just disappear if that should disappear if we adopt that second interpretation of sustainable development. I will stop here, and sorry for being a little bit too long. Thank you.